Hello there, my name is Vanessa Smedley and I'm a painter. Well, 'tis the season of love once more, so we are going to paint these little heart-shaped balloons right here. One of them has kind of got a mirror effect, the other one is kind of satiny, so we're going to look at those two different metallic effects and how to achieve them in watercolor. So, let's do this! Here are the materials for today. Go ahead and screenshot that, or they are listed in the description of the video for you. I'm starting out today by masking off the very white highlights on the crinkle edges of the balloons. So I am dipping my brush, a very cheap old brush, into a mixture of dish soap and water before I dip it into the masking fluid to protect the brushes, and then I'm just adding the masking fluid. I will allow that to dry for at least 30 minutes before I carry on painting. I'm starting out by mixing up all the colors for the red balloon. Here I have some Pyrrol Scarlet by itself, and then I mix some Pyrrol Scarlet with Alizarin Crimson to give it kind of a neutral red tone, somewhere halfway in the middle of cool and warm. Next I have some Alizarin Crimson by itself. And then I mix some Alizarin Crimson with some Sap Green to neutralize that and bring it into a darker shadow color. I'm starting with the red balloon first, which is the one with the mirror effect. So I'm going to wet the entire thing, and then we're going to use a wet on wet technique for this to make it really smooth to start out with on the first layer. The first color I'm dropping in here is the Pyrrol Scarlet. Since it is the warmest of the tones, it has the most orange in it. We're going to start out on the lightest areas of the balloon using that color, get those all nice and filled in. And now we're going to start adding in the medium tone that we have, which is the Pyrrol Scarlet that is mixed with Alizarin Crimson. We're going to use that in all of the mid-tones here. I'm going ahead and adding in a thicker consistency of that color while we're at it, because we don't want it to fade too much once it dries. Next, we have a really bright highlight in this lightest area right here. So I'm taking a damp brush that I've squeezed some of the water out of, and I'm lifting out that paint. Now, it is so wet that it is filling back in, so you kind of have to do this multiple times in order to get it to kind of stay where it's mostly white. We don't want it completely white, but mostly white. So just continue to lift that out where it needs to go. And then doing a few of the other sort of contouring highlight areas as well, just lifting those out as well. And as you're doing this, you definitely want to rinse your brush in between and squeeze out the water again, because otherwise you'll just be adding that color right back in. It's time to let that layer dry while we mix up the colors for the magenta balloon. We're starting out with a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta by itself here. Next I mix some Opera Pink with some Carbazole Violet, just to give it a little bit cooler of a tone and a little bit less neon, to be honest. Next I mix Quinacridone Magenta with some Sap Green to make it nice and dark and gray it out a little bit. And then add just a little bit of Carbazole Violet to bring in just that little tiny bit of a purple tone to it. I'm going to start out the exact same way that I did the last balloon, and that is wetting the entire thing, because in this layer they pretty much are kind of the same thing. The difference is going to become when you start adding in some of the details on the red one. That's where you're going to get the difference between the satin and the shiny metallic. So I'm wetting this entire thing first, and then I begin with the lightest tones, which in this case is the Opera Pink mix. Next we add in the Quinacridone Magenta here as the medium tone. Up close to where these balloons are touching, there's a lot of red reflection from the red balloon onto the magenta balloon, so I'm adding in my medium red here so that it can have a lot of that reflection. Next, I add in that darkest tone that has all the sap green in it for the cast shadow from the other balloon and for the shadow side of the left balloon. I think that opera pink needs to be a little more intense, so I'm adding in quite a bit of that, just as intensely as I can get it in there. And then I'm taking a damp brush and I'm lifting out the highlights in that area. Adding in a bit more of that opera pink pigment that just needs a little bit more intensity, and then I'm spraying it to make sure that it is continuing to move, because we don't want that to be a hard edge, especially for this satin balloon. Since the satin is going to have a softer transition in its highlights, it definitely has to be continuing to move. And it's time to let that dry and move back to the red balloon. Now that the red balloon is dry, we're going to come back in with some more details. Right here I'm adding some of the medium red and I'm softening that with clean water on the edges. That's a little bit of a softer blend, but here is where we start putting in some of the details that make it a little bit more metallic and shiny. So you'll have some harder edged areas, which is basically just the reflection of my front door, to be honest, because that's where I took these photos. And we're going to add that hard line right here because it's a darker door and it's open. So we're adding that in right here, and then on the edges of this thing you have to make sure that that's where you see the contours of this shiny balloon. So I'm painting that darker color around the lighter color in those kind of wrinkled patterns that you see along the edge of those types of balloons. And we're leaving that fairly harsh because it is kind of a harsh line. I'm just continuing to darken some of these areas, and then of course you have to add those little bumps on the edge. You've got that seam that goes down the sides of these type of balloons that is kind of bumpy. Then I'm going to leave that layer to dry while I go back to the magenta balloon. I think before I dive into the detail on this one, I think this red reflection needs to be a little more intense, so I'm adding that in there a little thicker and then softening the edges with clean water, and then I'm going to let that dry again before I add any detail to it. Alright, so it's nice and dry, and I'm coming back in with my very darkest color that has the Sap Green and the Carbazole Violet in it, and I'm adding in that cast shadow nice and dark, nice and thick right here, right next to the other balloon. And I'm softening that out with clean water, and I'm gonna darken also the shadow side on the left side. Basically just a lot of darkening here for this one. And then of course I'm adding in those little wrinkles right here in this little highlight area, and then I'll come back in and intensify the highlight area eventually. But for right now I'm gonna let it dry. Jumping back to the red balloon, I'm using my very darkest of the reds that has a lot of sap green in it, and I'm coming in on the darkest parts of this very shiny reflection. And this is where you leave most of this pretty harsh on the edges because it's just where that darkest reflection is. Now in this area, if you really zoom up, it is extremely detailed, and I could have driven myself crazy with that detail, but I didn't go quite that overboard with it. I kind of just suggested all of that tiny little detail. Like, I certainly did not make sure every tiny little wrinkle was in the exact right spot or everything had the perfect gradient or anything like that. Now, if you're a stickler for detail, you certainly could go that detailed if you want to. However, it definitely was not essential in order to get the effect that I was going for, so I kind of fudged it a little bit. Now, in speaking about the difference between this very shiny balloon as opposed to the more satin effect balloon that's next to it, the difference between the two is really just the reflection. The reflection in the shiny one is going to be a lot crisper, and the other one is going to be a lot kind of blurrier, and you won't see the details of the things that are reflecting in it as much. Or really, you won't see any details or harsh lines at all in the satin one, because it's really quite a lot more of a softer gradient, if you will. I've added a little bit of Payne's Gray to my darkest magenta color here, and I'm adding that right where it's touching the other balloon for the darkest cast shadow. And then I'm just darkening up some of the other details, adding a few more wrinkles and things like that. When I'm adding in the very darkest color on this satin balloon, I'm actually not making it as harsh as I did the other one because, like I said, you're not going to have the harsh lines on this one. I'm softening the edges. I've allowed all of that to dry, and now I think that this highlight area could be a little bit more intense. If you look at the reference photo, it's definitely more intense. So I'm going over this with the Opera Pink, and then I'm lifting out just a little bit of it, but very soft, very subtle for that satin effect. Back to the red one, I think we need to make a little bit of this darker, so I've added some Payne's Gray into my darkest mix, and I'm going into the very, very darkest details and reflections on this red balloon. And then I guess we'll do the same thing to the other one, because it does need just a tiny little bit more darkening in the very darkest darks, and along the seam of this balloon as well. It's time to remove the masking fluid that I put in at the very beginning, so I'm using a rubber cement eraser to take all of that out. And then, of course, as masking fluid tends to do, it's made quite a harsh line around the edges. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a nice watery mix of each color, and I am knocking back the craziness of that white because it's just a little bit too glaring. Of course, we have to add in the strings because right now these lovely little balloons are just floating in air with no attachment whatsoever. So I'm just adding in the color of each one, and then I'm going to come back with a little bit of a darker color for a little bit of a shadow effect. I don't want to spend too much time on that though. Tiny little bit darker in the middle of these highlight areas, and then I think I'm going to call the painting part done and come back in with a white brush pen for the very highest highlights on some of these areas. And here's the finished painting, all signed in with the tape removed. And you know, I do think that they come off as two completely different types of metallic effects. So there you go. And there you have it, a nice little exercise in different metallic effects that you could possibly use for your Valentine's card if you do that. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share all of that stuff because that's how this channel gets to grow. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again in 2 weeks.